In March 1998, 2-year-old Emma Gibson vanished from her front yard in rural Oregon while her father, a sheriff's deputy, was out for a jog. Search teams combed the fields, the rivers, and the neighboring woods for days. No footprints, no fibers, no blood, nothing at all to explain her disappearance. The answer would take 3 years to surface through the trembling voice of a child. How could a little girl vanish from a yard no bigger than a living room on a quiet morning under the watch of a man trained to find the missing? Ely, Oregon, sits quietly in the hills of Douglas County, a town that once lived by logging and learned to live without it. In March 1998, the Gibson family woke to one of those ordinary mornings that never announce what they are about to take. Their house stood at the end of a gravel road, a single-story home with a small fenced yard and a swing that tilted slightly to one side. Larry Gibson, 34 years old, was a deputy sheriff with Douglas County, known in town as steady, clean-cut, a man who could be trusted with difficult cases. That morning, Judith cleaned the kitchen while the children played in and out of the living room. Larry had the day off and planned to go for his usual morning run before lunch. He said he needed the fresh air to clear his head, and Judith nodded without looking up from the sink. It was their familiar rhythm, the one they had settled into over years of marriage. He ran to stay sharp. She kept the household moving smoothly, and the children found their own corners to fill. The television played faintly in another, clear's throat, room. Some morning cartoon show with bright voices. Somewhere outside, the creek that ran behind their property murmured steadily over smooth stones. Emma was already in the front yard when Larry came out to tie his running shoes on the porch. The yard was not large, barely 20 feet deep before it met the low wooden fence. But to a toddler with blonde curls and bright, curious eyes, it was an entire country to explore. The grass was still wet from the morning dew, and the little girl's shoes made soft prints where she pushed her toy truck in slow, deliberate lines across the lawn. Larry leaned casually against the porch railing, watching his daughter for a quiet moment. Judith called from inside the house that Karen would be coming out soon to watch her little sister. Larry said he would only be gone for a short run, maybe 2 miles at most, nothing more than his usual route. He carried his service pistol in a holster at his hip, even on his day off. Deputies in Douglas County often did this out of habit, part of the uniform mentality that stayed with them even in civilian clothes. He checked the latch on the front gate carefully, told his daughter to wait for her big sister, and jogged down the gravel driveway. The little girl lifted her head, waved a small hand, still clumsy with baby fat, and said something that sounded like, "Bye, Daddy." Her voice was high and sweet, carried on the morning air like a small bell ringing. The road from the Gibson house wound past open fields, then turned gradually toward a dense stand of pine trees. Larry settled into his familiar, steady pace, the kind of rhythm that kept his mind empty and his body moving. Half a mile down the quiet road, he saw a flicker of movement near the drainage ditch. A gray cat, one he immediately recognized from his neighbor's property down the way. The same cat that had been tearing through his trash cans for weeks, scattering garbage across his driveway. He had complained about it more than once to the neighbors, even called the County Humane Society. But no one ever came out that far into the country to collect stray animals. Out here in rural Oregon, people generally handled their own problems without waiting for official help. Larry slowed his pace, drew his .45 caliber Colt pistol from its leather holster, and fired once towards the ditch where the cat crouched. The sharp crack of the gunshot echoed through the still morning air, scattering a handful of crows from a nearby wooden fence post. He waited a few seconds, saw nothing move in the underbrush, and calmly holstered the weapon again. It was the kind of small act that hardly registered in his mind as significant at all. A minor irritation answered and forgotten before his next breath came and went. He kept jogging down the empty road. The run took longer than he had originally planned that morning. The road dipped into low, marshy ground, then rose toward the ridge where the forest thickened into darkness. The air smelled distinctly of pine pitch and wet bark from recent rain. He turned back after what he estimated was roughly 2 miles of distance. By the time he reached his own driveway again, sweating lightly, his watch read 12:15 in the afternoon. Judith was standing on the porch, one hand shading her eyes against the bright midday light. Her voice carried sharp and urgent across the yard before he even reached the steps. "Larry, is she with you?" He stopped short, breathing hard from the run. "Who are you talking about?" "Emma, she's gone. I can't find her anywhere." At first, he thought she must be joking or somehow mistaken about the situation. The front yard looked exactly as it had when he had left less than an hour earlier. The swing hung perfectly still. The plastic toy truck lay tipped on its side in the grass. The wooden gate stood open perhaps an inch wider than before. He called his daughter's name loudly, then even louder when no response came. Clear's throat, nothing answered him except the whisper of wind through the trees. He checked systematically behind the porch steps, inside the small storage shed, and the narrow space between the fence and the old wood pile stacked against the house. Judith ran frantically along the drainage ditch, peering desperately into the thick brush and calling her daughter's name. They circled the entire house twice, calling repeatedly until their voices went hoarse and raw. When the frantic search of their property turned up absolutely nothing, Larry grabbed the keys to his patrol car and drove quickly up the road. The horn blared continuously as he moved slowly forward, windows down, shouting his daughter's name. He stopped at the first intersection, called out again into the empty air, reversed direction, and came back to the house. Judith was still standing by the porch steps, crying now, her hands shaking uncontrollably. At 12:55 in the afternoon, they finally called the Douglas County Sheriff's Department. The dispatcher's voice was professionally calm and steady on the line. 2-year-old female, last seen in front yard, blonde hair, blue eyes, no known medical issues. By 1:30 that afternoon, the first patrol units had arrived at the remote property. A volunteer firefighter from Elia pulled his red truck into the narrow driveway. Other neighbors and friends followed quickly behind. Church members, people from Larry's own Boy Scout troop that he led on weekends. Strangers who had heard the call on police scanners. Within 1 hour, the yard and the road beyond it were completely lined with parked vehicles. The sheriff's office quickly set up a makeshift command post near the mailbox at the end of the drive. Search dogs were brought in first from a regional K-9 unit trained specifically for missing persons. Their professional handlers led the animals in slow, methodical circles through the front yard, then down the gravel road. The dogs caught a faint scent trail at the gate, followed it roughly 50 yards down the road, then suddenly lost it completely at the curve where the pavement began. Helicopters from the Oregon State Police swept low overhead, their rotor blades kicking up dust into the still air. Dozens of men waded carefully through the cold creek, combed through the tall grass by the fence line, checked systematically under porches and inside sheds. The afternoon hours bled together into a continuous blur of motion and shouting. Judith moved mechanically through the chaos, answering the same questions over and over, pointing repeatedly to the last place she had seen her daughter playing. Larry walked the search perimeter again and again in his running clothes, his face completely expressionless. When deputies asked him directly how long he had been gone from the house, he said approximately 45 minutes total. The responding deputies wrote his answer down carefully in their notebooks, nodding without any verbal comment. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the official search grid stretched nearly 2 m in every direction from the house. Neighbors checked their barns and storage sheds methodically. Volunteer firefighters marked each cleared area with bright orange surveyor's tape. Nothing turned up anywhere despite the intensive efforts. Not a single shoe, not one clear footprint, not even a broken twig to suggest which direction she might have gone. As the sun dipped slowly behind the western ridge, the temperature dropped noticeably in the shadows. Hot coffee was passed around among the searchers in disposable paper cups. Someone kindly offered to drive Judith into town to rest at a friend's house, but she refused absolutely to leave her own home. "She will come back here," Judith said firmly. "She always comes back here when she is scared." Larry went inside the house briefly and returned wearing his full-turn deputy's uniform. He told a colleague quietly that it felt right somehow, like he needed to look official and in control. Judith did not answer or look at him when he said this. Outside, the search continued in widening circles through the forest, each team coming back empty-handed and exhausted. By 6 o'clock that evening, the sheriff himself called the search to a temporary pause for safety reasons. "We will start again at first light tomorrow morning," he said quietly to the assembled volunteers. "We are not done searching yet." The tired volunteers nodded silently, pale and drawn in the fading evening light. One of them carefully picked up the yellow plastic toy truck from the wet grass and set it gently on the porch railing as if to keep it safe until the child returned. When the last of the volunteer vehicles finally pulled away down the gravel road, the sound of their engines faded slowly into the surrounding hills. All that remained was the whisper of wind moving through the tall trees. Judith stood alone on the porch, arms crossed tight against the growing cold of evening. Larry stayed silently beside her, scanning the darkening yard as though their daughter might simply step back into it at any moment. The house behind them glowed dimly through the windows where lights had been left burning. Inside, the kitchen table was still set for lunch, the sandwiches sitting untouched on paper plates. The swing in the yard moved once in the evening wind, its chains creaking softly. For a long time, neither of them spoke a single word to each other. The world had narrowed completely to the small patch of grass where their daughter had last stood, and the terrible silence that surrounded it felt heavier than any sound. The search maps lay folded neatly on the hood of a patrol car with lines of red ink circling a center point that had given absolutely nothing back to the searchers. The search for Emma Gibson did not end with the setting sun that first terrible day. At first light on March 19, 1998, a fresh search grid was drawn across the wooded hills surrounding Elyria. Deputies from neighboring towns joined the effort along with off-duty officers and volunteers from the local Mormon church congregation. Among the very first to arrive were members of Larry's own Boy Scout troop, teenagers wearing green shirts and neckerchiefs. They carried flashlights and walkie-talkies, moving through the dense brush in straight, coordinated lines. Each of them called the little girl's name as if a louder voice might somehow bring her back from wherever she had gone. By mid-morning, nearly 100 people were actively searching the area in organized teams. Helicopters from the Oregon State Police swept low over Swamp Creek, and mounted deputies on horseback carefully searched the far muddy banks. The temperature dropped noticeably as fog settled along the ridges, and every shout seemed to fade uselessly into the thick gray mist. Larry moved steadily among the searchers, appearing calm and methodical in his movements, giving clear orders when asked. He carried a clipboard, carefully noted search zones on a detailed map, and checked off areas as they were cleared. Those who knew him personally said he looked like a professional, doing his job efficiently. Those who did not know him well found his obvious composure strange and somewhat unsettling. Judith stayed close by the house, absolutely refusing to rest or leave for even a moment. Each time a vehicle slowed near the driveway entrance, she looked up quickly, desperately hoping it was someone bringing news of her daughter. None ever came with good information. By noon on the second day, the sheriff personally told Judith they were expanding the search perimeter another full mile in every direction. Larry nodded in silent agreement, then went inside the house to change his clothes. When he came back out again a short time later, he was freshly shaved and dressed in his complete 10 deputy's uniform. His badge was polished to a bright shine, his sidearm properly holstered at his hip. It was something no one present had ever seen before in a parent of a missing child under these circumstances. Deputies whispered quietly about his behavior that afternoon when he was out of earshot. One of them later wrote in his official report a carefully worded observation. Gibson appeared unusually composed for a father in this situation. Maintains strict control but lacks normal affect. States he needs to look professional for the media coverage. The press arrived in full force by the second day of searching. A news crew from Portland drove down and filmed the command post set up beside the Gibson home. Larry stood confidently in front of the cameras answering their questions in short clipped professional sentences. "We're doing everything we can," he said evenly. "Every single minute counts in a case like this." His voice was steady and controlled, his face showing almost no expression at all. Judith stood silently beside him, pale and visibly shaken, unable to speak when reporters directed questions toward her. In the days that followed, the search operation grew steadily outward like a dark stain spreading across a map. Fields, creeks, roads, and abandoned properties were combed again and again by exhausted volunteers. Deputies systematically marked off abandoned sheds, empty wells, and dangerous drainage ditches throughout the area. Teams of dedicated volunteers searched the dense forest by lantern light long after midnight had passed. They found various footprints in the soft mud, but none were small enough to belong to a 2-year-old child. The yellow plastic toy truck left abandoned in the yard was the only physical trace of Emma Gibson that anyone ever recovered. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office began carefully reconstructing the precise timeline of that morning. Larry stated clearly that he had left his home at 11:30 in the morning for his jog. The route he described, roughly 2 miles round trip through the countryside, should have taken approximately 20 minutes to complete. He claimed he returned to the house around 12:15 that afternoon. Judith placed the moment she realized her daughter was actually missing closer to 12:30. The emergency call to dispatch was officially logged at 12:55. That left nearly 35 minutes that no one could properly account for in the official record. Then there was the unexplained issue with his patrol car that raised immediate questions. Larry had driven his department-issued patrol vehicle that morning. A white sheriff's sedan with the official department insignia clearly visible on both doors. Deputies noted it was highly unusual for him to use the vehicle while officially off duty. The odometer reading showed an additional 7 miles that were not accounted for in any duty log. When questioned directly about this discrepancy, Larry calmly explained that after frantically searching the yard, he had driven to a nearby rest area to check whether his daughter had somehow wandered that far from home. Clear his throat, the sheriff accepted this explanation for the moment without pressing further, but made a careful note of it in the file. If you have ever noticed small details that do not quite fit together, you understand why investigators could not let these questions go. A second significant inconsistency emerged clearly a few days later during follow-up interviews. Larry admitted to firing his service weapon that morning, saying he had taken a single shot at a stray cat before beginning his run. He claimed he had missed the animal completely. When investigators returned to search the area he described near the tree-in, they found a dead gray cat lying in the ditch approximately 50 yards from the road. 2 separate bullets had entered through the animal's skull and chest. Ballistic tests quickly matched both rounds to Larry's department-issued pistol. It was an odd detail that stood out, one detective later recalled in his notes. People miss their target sometimes, and people lie about small things, but rarely do both happen in the exact same story with physical evidence. By the end of March 1998, the large organized search effort was officially scaled back due to resource constraints. The helicopters were grounded, and most of the volunteers gradually went home to their own families. A much smaller investigative team took over, carefully reviewing statements, collecting laboratory results, and methodically checking every lead that came through the tip line. A dozen possible sightings of Emma came in through the dedicated tip line over the next few weeks. Someone reported seeing a blonde toddler at a highway rest stop. Another caller described a similar child in a grocery store parking lot 2 counties away, but each reported sighting was carefully investigated and dismissed within hours as mistaken identity. Then came a statement from 4-year-old Karen Gibson that changed everything about the investigation. During a careful interview with 2 experienced child forensic detectives, the little girl said she had seen a truck pull into their driveway while her father was out jogging that morning. Inside the truck, she said quietly, were a blonde woman and a dark-haired man she did not recognize. They took Emma, she said in a small voice. They drove away with her. The detectives asked her gently to describe the vehicle she remembered seeing. She said hesitantly that it was yellow or maybe brownish in color, an older truck. They asked if she knew the people she had seen. She shook her head firmly. She said they did not talk to her at all, just took her sister and left quickly. The statement was carefully written down word for word in the official report, though no one could immediately verify any part of it. There were no tire tracks visible on the gravel road from that morning. No neighbors anywhere in the area reported seeing any truck matching that description on that particular day. Still, the description was officially released to the public through all available media channels. Tan or gold pickup truck, possibly older model. 2 occupants sought for questioning. For weeks afterward, that image was everywhere throughout Oregon on posters taped to store windows, in television newscasts, in the minds of people driving down highways. No such vehicle matching that description was ever found, despite intensive searching. Inside the Douglas County Sheriff's Department, serious doubts began to circle quietly among the investigators. Officers who had worked directly alongside Larry for many years said he seemed increasingly distant, emotionally detached, and sometimes visibly irritated when questioned about timeline details. He rarely spoke about his missing daughter directly in any personal way. When he did mention Emma, his voice stayed completely flat and emotionless. The sheriff held a private confidential meeting with senior staff members in early April to discuss the case. Officially, the case remained classified as a standard missing child investigation in all public records. Unofficially, senior investigators began to wonder seriously whether something else entirely had happened that morning. The issue was extremely delicate and politically sensitive for the department. Larry was one of their own officers, a deputy with 12 solid years on the force. He was a father, a church member, a man whose house they had all searched and whose wife they had comforted. But the established facts stubbornly refused to sit still or make sense together. The jogging route that should have taken 20 minutes had somehow taken nearly 50 minutes total. The shot at the cat that was supposed to miss had struck twice with deadly accuracy. The patrol car that should have been parked at home had mysteriously moved 7 additional miles. And through all of it, through every interview and every question, Larry's composed demeanor never once cracked or wavered. The media attention surrounding the case gradually waned by summer as news stories demanded coverage. Reporters moved on to other missing children cases, and Elia went back to its usual quiet pace. The Gibson house, once crowded daily with search teams and volunteers, looked untouched again from the outside. Judith stopped giving any interviews to reporters after the first month had passed. She attended church services less frequently, spending most of her time at home alone with Karen. Larry officially returned to work in June, but was kept on administrative duty and limited patrol. He filed routine paperwork, drove patrol only occasionally when absolutely necessary, and avoided most social interaction. Inside the department, whispers and speculation followed him everywhere like a persistent shadow. One deputy recalled walking into the locker room unexpectedly and finding Larry staring at his own reflection in the mirror for a very long time. When asked how he was holding up emotionally, Larry had simply said, "You just keep doing what you know how to do every day." In July, the sheriff officially placed him on administrative leave pending further internal review of the case. The department publicly cited the need for rest and emotional distance from the investigation. Clear his throat, Larry accepted the decision without any protest or complaint. The investigation continued methodically into the fall season of 1998. Detectives systematically re-entered neighbors, reviewed all call logs again, and compared witness statements looking for inconsistencies. Nothing substantial changed in the official record. No one had seen any tan truck in the area. No one had heard any kind of struggle or crying. The front yard where Emma had played showed no signs of disturbance at all. No footprints except her own small ones in the damp grass. The Oregon State Police Laboratory confirmed the ballistics findings in their official report. The same 2 bullets recovered from the dead cat fired from the same weapon Larry carried. But without any concrete evidence directly linking those shots to his daughter's disappearance, it was essentially meaningless on paper alone. Judith, interviewed again in September by a different detective, described her husband as increasingly quiet, tired, and trying desperately not to think about what had happened. She said she wanted to believe the story about the truck, wanted to believe that someone else had taken their daughter. But when asked directly if she trusted Larry's version of events completely, she hesitated for several long seconds before answering carefully. "I think he tells what he can live with," she said quietly. For those who have ever doubted someone they love, you know how those words can hang in the air forever. By winter, the case had slowed to barely a crawl with no new leads. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office filed its last progress report in December 1998. The opening line read simply and coldly. "Investigation ongoing. Subject remains missing. No further developments to report." Larry spent the Christmas holidays at home with his family in an atmosphere of crushing silence. Karen asked again and again where her little sister was. Judith told her that Emma was with the Angels now, then immediately corrected herself, saying they were still looking and hoping. Larry said absolutely nothing during these painful conversations. In early January 1999, he submitted his formal resignation from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department. The letter was short and typed on official department stationery. "For personal and family reasons, I am unable to continue my duties at this time. Respectfully, Deputy Larry Dean Gibson." The sheriff accepted his resignation without any comment or ceremony. When Larry left the office for the last time on a gray January afternoon, a few colleagues stood awkwardly by the door. No one knew whether to shake his hand or say goodbye. He nodded once, said simply, "Take care," and walked out into the cold rain. The patrol car he turned in at the motor pool still smelled faintly of disinfectant. The odometer read 58,137 miles exactly. After Larry Gibson resigned from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department in early 1999, the family left Oregon quietly without any public announcement. There were no farewell notices in the local newspaper, no goodbye gatherings from the department or church. One cold spring morning, their furniture was loaded into a rented moving truck, and by the following week, the house on the gravel road stood completely empty. They moved 900 m northeast to a small town near Helena, Montana, a remote place where no one knew their faces, where a man could start over without being asked too many difficult questions about his past. Larry told new neighbors he had left law enforcement to focus on his family and took a job selling insurance policies. He shaved off his mustache, traded his deputy's uniform for pressed dress shirts and ties, and learned to talk about coverage plans instead of search grids. At first, the new town welcomed them with typical small-town kindness. The local Mormon congregation, hearing that the Gibsons had transferred from Oregon, helped them find a rental house on a quiet residential street. Larry joined the men's group on weekends, bringing donuts and shaking hands firmly with everyone. Judith brought Karen to church activities, always polite and reserved with other mothers. People said she seemed tired but kind, her smile never quite reaching her eyes anymore. For a few months, they passed as an ordinary family dealing with some unspecified hardship. Larry kept a steady job, paid bills on time, and volunteered for local scout events again. Judith stayed home, and by summer, she was noticeably pregnant with another child. She gave birth to a daughter, Lisa, that August, a dark-haired baby who slept easily and rarely cried. For a while, it seemed like they had somehow managed to build something new out of what had been completely shattered. But beneath the surface, the silence in their home grew thicker and more oppressive. Larry did not talk about Oregon at all. When neighbors asked why they had moved from such a beautiful state, he said only that it had been a hard time for the family. At home, he avoided the subject altogether with Judith and the children. He kept to a strict routine every single day. Work, church, dinner, television, sleep. He spoke very little to Judith, even less to Karen. When the subject of Emma surfaced in any way, he would simply leave the room without a word. Judith tried to be patient with his grief, but she felt the distance hardening between them like ice. The weight of that unspoken absence lingered in every corner of their small house. Emma's name was never officially banned, yet it was never said aloud by anyone. Clear's throat, when Judith prayed alone at night, she sometimes whispered her daughter's name under her breath, afraid Larry might somehow hear her. Karen, now 7 years old, did not understand the silent rules that governed their household. She still remembered her little sister's face clearly, the yellow toy truck, the sound of Emma's laughter in the yard. Sometimes she asked directly where Emma was. Other times she woke up crying in the middle of the night, insisting that she had seen her sister in her dreams. "Daddy hurt Emma," she mumbled once, half asleep, twisting in her blankets. "He put her in the ground." Judith froze completely when she heard those words. It was the kind of sentence that hung in the dark air long after it was spoken, fragile, but impossible to ignore or forget. She asked Karen gently what she meant, but the child said nothing more that night. In the morning, Karen did not seem to remember saying anything at all. At church, the Gibson family story traveled quickly and whispers among the congregation. People knew something tragic had happened back in Oregon involving a missing child, a family destroyed, a man leaving law enforcement. But the specific details remained cloudy and unclear. The community offered genuine sympathy at first through castles, visits, and invitations to dinner. Then slowly came distance and coolness. Conversation stopped when Larry entered a room. The warmth turned polite, then noticeably cool. One Sunday after services, the bishop asked Larry directly if he planned to reapply for police work in Montana. Larry shook his head firmly. "That part of my life is over," he said with finality. He did not mention that the Oregon State Police had kept his file open, or that the sheriff, who once worked beside him, now avoided his phone calls completely. Judith felt the growing isolation more deeply than Larry did. She missed her friends back in Oregon terribly. Missed the few people who still asked about Emma. In Montana, no one did. She tried to make new connections with other mothers at church, with neighbors, with other young families. But the conversations always stayed on the surface, never going deeper. It was hard to build friendships around a story you could never tell. As months passed, the marriage began to fray visibly at the edges. Larry withdrew further into his routine, often spending evenings at the office or driving around without explaining where he went. Judith grew increasingly suspicious, but said nothing directly to him. Their arguments, when they finally came, were quiet and cutting. "You do not talk to me anymore," she said once at the dinner table. "I talk when there is something to say," he replied coldly. After that night, she stopped asking questions altogether. Karen's nightmares became more frequent that winter. She would wake up screaming, saying she saw Emma crying by the porch or lying on the ground. Judith sat with her until she fell asleep again, brushing her hair and whispering that everything was fine. But when Karen was finally asleep, Judith stayed awake, staring at the dark ceiling. She began to wonder if her daughter was remembering something real, not just dreaming it. One afternoon, while cleaning Karen's room, Judith found a crayon drawing tucked carefully under the pillow. It showed 4 stick figures drawn in different colors. A man, a woman, a small girl, and another smaller figure drawn in faint gray lying near the corner of the page. Above them was a yellow sun, smiling, as children's suns always do. Judith folded the drawing carefully and put it in her dresser drawer. She never mentioned it to Larry. For those who have found evidence you were not looking for, you know that terrible moment when you must decide what to do with it. By early 2001, the distance between them had become impossible to ignore or repair. Larry had started sleeping on the couch, claiming the baby's crying kept him awake at night. Judith did not argue with this explanation. She began making plans quietly, saving small amounts of money from groceries, writing letters to her mother back in Oregon. When she finally told Larry she wanted to go back home for a while, he did not protest. "Do what you need to do," he said without emotion. It was the closest he had come to giving permission in months. In January 2001, nearly 3 years after Emma vanished, Judith packed the car with clothes, toys, and the baby's things. Karen sat silently in the back seat, clutching a stuffed animal. Larry stood in the driveway, hands in his pockets, expression completely unreadable. "Take care of yourself," he said. Judith looked at him for a long moment, searching for something that was not there anymore. Then she started the car and drove away. The road back to Oregon wound through the same mountain ranges they had once crossed together as a family. Snow still clung to the mountain shoulders, and the radio faded in and out. Karen slept most of the way, her head resting against the window. When they stopped for gas near Spokane, Judith looked in the rearview mirror and saw her own face, pale, older, like someone who had waited too long to move. They reached Oregon after 2 long days of driving. Judith stayed with her mother in Eugene, sharing a small room with the girls. It was not much, but it felt safer somehow. She found part-time work at a laundromat and began rebuilding her life quietly, piece by piece. Every now and then, she thought about calling the Douglas County Sheriff's Office to ask for updates on Emma's case, but she never did. It had been 3 years since her daughter vanished, and the thought of hearing the same rehearsed answer again felt heavier than silence. Back in Montana, Larry lived alone now in the empty house. He kept it clean, drove to work, attended church less frequently. Neighbors said he was polite but distant, a man who seemed only half present. He stopped mentioning his family altogether. In the evenings, he sat by the window, watching cars pass on the road below. The television played quietly in the background with local news, sports, the hum of other people's lives. No one in town asked about the missing child from Oregon, and he never offered the story. Sometimes late at night, he opened a small box he kept in a drawer. Inside were photographs of better times. Emma on her 2nd birthday, Karen with her first school ribbon, Judith smiling faintly at a picnic. He looked at them for a few minutes, then closed the box again. He had started attending church alone. When the congregation sang hymns about redemption, he stood silent, eyes fixed on the page. Afterward, he would shake hands with the bishop and leave without staying for coffee. By autumn, few people in Montana remembered that the Gibsons had come there as a family. Most knew Larry only as the quiet insurance agent who kept to himself. He rarely mentioned Oregon, and when he did, it was with the tone of someone speaking about a dream half remembered. Back in Oregon, Judith began to notice Karen's drawings again. More careful, less dark, but always with one missing figure. When asked, Karen said she did not know why she drew that way. "It just feels right," she said. Judith understood. There are absences that take shape even in a child's hands. The file on Emma Gibson sat untouched in the Douglas County evidence room, dust settling on its edge. But something was still moving quietly beneath all that silence. Not in the records or the reports, but in the half-formed memories of a little girl who could not sleep through the night. 3 years after Emma Gibson vanished, the silence finally cracked. Not through evidence, not through new witnesses, but through the small, uncertain voice of a 7-year-old girl. It began in February 2001 inside a small rental house in Eugene, Oregon. Karen Gibson had grown quieter with age, a cautious child with watchful eyes, who spoke carefully. But that winter, she began to wake again in the middle of the night, crying for her sister. The nightmares had returned, sharper now, more vivid and detailed. Judith would find her sitting up in bed, trembling, saying she had seen Emma outside, that she could hear Daddy yelling. At first, Judith tried to soothe her with the same reassurances she had offered for years. "It was a dream, honey. Daddy did not mean to scare you," but the sentences did not calm her anymore. The next morning, Judith noticed Karen had drawn another picture. This one showed a man in a brown uniform standing over a smaller figure on the ground. Above them, a car with flashing lights. She tucked the drawing away carefully, but could not shake the unease. A week later, during a counseling session arranged through her elementary school, Karen began to talk. The counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Ellen Wright, asked gentle questions about home, about family, about what Karen remembered of Oregon before Montana. The child hesitated for a long time, then whispered something that made Ellen stop writing. That afternoon, Ellen called Judith to the office. Karen sat beside her mother, clutching a stuffed animal tightly. Her words came out haltingly, pieced together from memory fragments. "Emma followed Daddy outside," she said quietly. "Daddy was mad. He told her to stop. He hit her." She made a quick motion with her hand, an imitation of a strike, then quieter still. "He put her in the car, the one with the lights." Judith stared at her daughter, unsure what she was hearing. "Are you sure?" she asked. Karen nodded. "He told me not to tell. He said he would put me in the hole, too." The room went completely still. Ellen Wright documented the statement carefully and, following mandatory reporting laws, immediately contacted the Eugene Police Department. Within 24 hours, the file was transferred to Douglas County, and the case of Emma Gibson, missing since March 18, 1998, was officially reopened. Detectives arrived at Judith's home 2 days later. They listened carefully as she recounted the timeline of events, her relocation to Montana, the deterioration of the marriage, and her decision to return to Oregon. Clear as throat, they asked about Larry's behavior, about his temper, about anything unusual she might have noticed. Judith hesitated, then admitted what she had long ignored. There had been moments, small and isolated at first, where Larry's control had slipped. Once he had thrown a chair, when Karen spilled juice. Another time, he had shouted so loudly the baby started screaming. She had told herself it was stress, grief, exhaustion. Now she was not sure. The detectives recorded everything, thanking her for her honesty. When they left, one of them said quietly, "We will need to talk to him." Back in Montana, Larry Gibson was still living in the same modest house on Cedar Street. To his neighbors, he was polite but detached. The man who waved but rarely lingered. He worked as an insurance agent for a regional company, attended church occasionally, and kept mostly to himself. On April 14, 2001, 2 plainclothes officers from Oregon knocked on his door. They had a warrant for second-degree murder. Larry did not resist. He opened the door, stepped aside, and let them in. Clear his throat. I figured this would come eventually, he said evenly. Inside the house, everything was tidy. The curtains were drawn, the sink clean. A framed photograph of Emma sat on a shelf, the little girl smiling beneath a paper birthday hat. The officers read Larry his rights, cut him gently, and led him to the car. As they passed the neighbor's lawn, a woman watering her garden paused to stare. Larry met her eyes briefly and nodded. He was extradited to Oregon within the week. When news of his arrest reached Eugene, Judith felt both vindicated and terrified. The past she had tried to outrun was now at her doorstep again. She agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, providing every document and letter she still had from their marriage. She also reached out to Larry's half-sister, Debbie Call, who lived in Iowa. Debbie had stayed close to Judith after the separation, though contact with Larry had ended years earlier. On the phone, when Judith told her about the new investigation, Debbie went silent for several seconds. Then she said quietly, "I think I need to tell you something." A few days later, she gave her statement to police. She described a late-night phone call she had received from Larry in the spring of 1998, weeks after Emma's disappearance. His voice, she said, was frantic, uneven. He said, "I think I killed her," Debbie recalled. Those were his exact words. I asked what he meant, but he would not explain. He just said it was an accident, that it all happened too fast. Then he hung up. Debbie had never gone to the police at the time. She said she thought Larry was having a breakdown. She regretted it now deeply. Her testimony, combined with Karen's recollection, gave the investigators what they needed: probable cause. The reopening of the case made headlines across Oregon. The story of the missing toddler had long been buried in small-town memory. But now the name Deputy Larry Gibson was back in print. The press described him as a former lawman accused of killing his own daughter. And the irony was not lost on anyone. Detectives re-examined every piece of evidence. They returned to the Gibson property in Elyria, now occupied by another family. They searched the creek again, the Clear's Throat, Old Woodpile, the fields beyond the fence. They dug through archived reports and found the notes from 1998. The inconsistencies, his jogging time, the odometer readings, the ballistics on the dead cat. The patterns that had once seemed like coincidences now looked like clues. Meanwhile, Larry sat in a county holding cell, calm as ever. Reporters waiting outside the courthouse shouted questions, but he never spoke. Through his attorney, he issued only one statement: "I am innocent of these accusations. I have no idea what happened to my daughter." The district attorney held a press conference confirming the arrest and the charge of second-degree murder. He spoke of new witness statements and significant corroboration of prior inconsistencies. He did not mention the child by name, but everyone knew. Judith stayed home that night. The television turned off. Karen played with her dolls quietly, unaware of the storm that was forming around her own testimony. As the case moved toward trial, more pieces surfaced. Old colleagues from the sheriff's department were interviewed again. Some admitted that even back in 1998, they had had doubts about Larry's account. "We wanted to believe him," one said. "He was one of us, but the story never fit right." A few officers recalled seeing him the morning after Emma vanished. Calm, clean-shaven, back in uniform. One deputy remembered asking him if he wanted to take leave. "No point sitting around," Larry had replied. The prosecutors built a narrative: a moment of anger, a fatal mistake, a cover-up disguised as grief. They did not claim premeditation, only control and concealment. By the end of April 2001, the evidence had been presented to a grand jury. The indictment came quickly. State of Oregon versus Larry Dean Gibson, second-degree murder, in connection with the death of Emma Rose Gibson, age 2. When the story broke on the evening news, the image they used was an old one. Larry in his deputy's uniform, hand resting on the shoulder of a smiling blonde girl with a toy truck. Underneath the caption read, "Father charged in daughter's disappearance." Neighbors in Montana watched in disbelief. To them, he had been quiet, polite, the man who shoveled his driveway before dawn. In Ely, the reaction was mixed. Sadness, anger, relief. The case that had haunted the town for 3 years had suddenly come alive again. Clear's throat, Judith avoided reporters, refusing every request for comment. She told a friend, "I do not feel vindicated. I just feel empty." Karen, too young to grasp the scale of what she had set in motion, asked why people were saying bad things about Daddy. Judith told her the truth would come out in time. When the detectives escorted Larry into the courthouse for arraignment, he kept his head high, eyes forward. The photographers shouted his name, flashes cutting through the air. One reporter asked if he had anything to say to his wife. He did not respond. Inside the courtroom, he stood as the charges were read. The words, "Murder in the second degree," echoed off the walls. He showed no reaction. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty. As he was led away, someone in the back of the courtroom whispered, "That is the deputy who lost his kid." Another voice replied, "That is the one who killed her." Judith did not attend the hearing. Instead, she sat at home with the girls, the blinds drawn, the phone off the hook. For the first time in years, she felt something like clarity, terrible, sharp, and undeniable. The silence that had ruled their lives was over. Outside, spring light flickered across the yard, catching the edge of the toy box by the window. Inside, Karen sat cross-legged on the floor, humming to herself, tracing shapes on the carpet with her finger. Judith watched her daughter for a long time and thought of all the years she had spent pretending not to know what she already felt. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.